U.S. forces killed 14 people in 4 separate airstrikes off the coast of Acapulco in the Pacific Ocean. This means that these strikes on alleged drug boats has now expanded beyond Venezuela, and we're locking in on Mexico.
The opinions of the guests and host are their own and do not represent the opinions of Ironclad, the Border Patrol, or the Department of Homeland Security.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Borderland Dispatches, an Ironclad original with yours truly, Katarina Schultz. So this made headlines because I had been getting asked over and over again about the strikes on the boats, the alleged drug trafficking boats off the coast of Venezuela. As that was happening, multiple people were killed, multiple boats were struck. And now this happened just 400 miles off of Acapulco. Okay, these airstrikes could not happen legally 200 miles and beyond. It can basically, this is the perfect threshold for this to uphold legally, I guess. You guys know how I feel about this. Okay, we know that Acapulco is a major port city. It's in the state of Guerrero. And over the course of my time reporting, covering Mexico and organized crime, I have heard it time and time again, whether that be from Mexican law enforcement or Mexican drug traffickers, that Acapulco is the spot. However, were these people drug traffickers 14? I've brought up this point time and time again. It's a huge number for what we're talking about. Typically, when drugs are being smuggled through maritime on boats, we're seeing a tight crew, 3, 4, maybe 5 people. So the strikes were ordered apparently directly by President Donald Trump. That's what U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said. The U.S. claims the vessels were known narco-trafficking boats, and I quote that, and they were moving along established smuggling routes. Essentially, anywhere along the coast of Acapulco could be considered a known smuggling route, okay? This has been going on for years. We all freaking know that any port city, particularly Acapulco in this case, is a smuggling route. I'm sure that there was intelligence gathered that showed that these boats were coming from somewhere and along somewhere that justified these strikes. But we'll get into the justification. I'll hit you with the facts first. And I also want to know what you guys think. I find that my audience is pretty split on these strikes. I also go sort of back and forth. For the most part, I just don't think this is very effective. But I know that a lot of you guys think, yeah, get them, boots on the ground, bomb them, boom. And a lot of other people say that, what the hell is going on? And I agree with that. It's actually funny. Everyone who believes in the former is not boots on the ground in Mexico. So shots fired. All right. There's apparently one survivor who is reportedly being sought by Mexico's Navy. And Mexico's Navy says that it's conducting search and rescue operations for any more survivors as well. Keep in mind, Mexico was unaware of these strikes, that they were going to happen. This is very different than Venezuela because we haven't really been seeing much response from Venezuela or any sort of condemnation. But in Mexico's case, we are seeing that. This is really the latest escalation in this U.S. campaign that's now killed at least 57 people in these similar operations across the Caribbean and now the Pacific. So this, though, in my opinion, is somewhat of a turning point. These are lethal, unilateral U.S. military actions in international waters. They're not coordinated arrests or interdictions. This is very much a U.S. operation, which is also why it took place 400 miles off the coast of Acapulco. It basically represents this shift from interdiction to preemptive strikes. And that's important to take note of because they're treating suspected smugglers as enemy combatants. These are not people who have gone through a judicial process or have public cold hard evidence against them that they are in fact smuggling illegal substances. These are people that the administration believes to be smugglers. These people don't have lawyers. They don't have a warning. So Trump and Hegseth are framing this as part of a non-international armed conflict against narco-terrorists. And this language is very important because it's meant to sidestep international law, okay? It justifies this lethal force. Whoa, not the lisp. It justifies this lethal force without congressional approval or foreign consent. In this case, Mexico's consent. This is also very different than Venezuela. Why? Because there's this whole regime change and Maduro is a narco himself situation going on. I mean, President Claudia Sheinbaum isn't too far off from having those ties, and I've said that before, but it's still a democratic country? Question mark? It is. It's a democracy. Other than the most, I guess, violent election in Mexican history. All right, that's not the point. The US is openly using this wartime language for what has historically been treated as law enforcement. Okay, so if anyone asks, I've been saying that there's this civil war, everyone's been saying there's this civil war going on in Sinaloa. Well, now there's sort of an international war. It's so crazy because when the US designated cartels as FTOs, foreign terrorist organizations, in January, my most asked question was, will there be strikes? Will there be boots on the ground? And I was like, likely yes. If they're being treated as terrorists, if this mirrors anything like the war on terror, that will likely happen. People then tried to say that I was calling for it. That's not the case. We know that there is already so much collateral damage when it comes to talking about the war on drugs and even the war on terror. You mix those two together, brace yourself for an absolute shitstorm where a lot of innocent people are going to die or their livelihoods are going to be ruined. Who are these 14 people? I'm really hoping that Mexico comes out with that information. I would love for the US too, but they haven't identified a single victim of these airstrikes. We'd love to know, and I urge, who are these people? Who are the targets? Who are the people dying in these strikes? Show me a freaking mugshot. Give me a full name. Tell me the affiliation with which cartel. What drug were they smuggling? It's really that simple. And President Claudia Sheinbaum condemned the strikes. She literally said, "We do not agree with these attacks." Of course she wouldn't. She has carried on the policy of her predecessor, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, sorry, AMLO for short, which was, he was the sort of first president to say, hugs, not bullets, okay? Abrazos, no balazos. And Claudia Sheinbaum hasn't fully taken that on, and she's never actually said that phrase out loud, but her approach is still more gentle than that of, let's say, Felipe Calderón, okay? Where it was literally full on military versus cartels shootout in neighborhoods. And I think that a big part of that policy has to do with the fact that there were so many innocent people who lost their lives to this violence. And so, of course, she's going to condemn these attacks, especially when they're not coordinated with the Mexican government. I mean, I would hate to be running a country and next thing you know, my northern neighbor is striking maritime vessels right along the coast of my country, killing people who are likely citizens of my country. That shit would piss me off too. So, President Sheinbaum called for respect of international treaties and instructed her Navy and Foreign Ministry to meet with the US ambassador. Not sure how far that's going to go. I can't see if what Hegseth is true, that President Trump directly ordered these attacks, I can't see the ambassador doing much to change his actions, to be completely honest. Mexico is really caught in between diplomatic outrage and dependency on US security cooperation. And I think more than anything, Sheinbaum would be frustrated because there has been a lot of cooperation. And you guys know I'm not a fan of the Mexican federal government, but I will give credit where credit is due. And the southern border lockdown, shutdown, whatever you want to call it, was a coordinated effort. Mexico participated in that too. And initially, the motivation for this, their incentive, was to avoid tariffs. Another coordinated effort would have to be the expulsion of all of the fugitives from Mexico. So you have major narcos sent over, not with the extradition treaty, so they can't file judicial injunctions. They don't get to, wait or avoid the death penalty once they get to the US. And these people are being prosecuted in the US because Mexico agreed to send them over. So I think now with this happening, yeah, there's going to be significant outrage from the Mexican federal government because up until right now, Mexico has essentially given in to every demand from the US to curb cartel activity. Now, the strike proximity to Mexican waters, just 400 miles off Acapulco, obviously adds to this like territorial sensitivity. That's not far at all. And to be completely honest, there are some major sort of rumors, I guess we could call them, of who is in Guerrero. That's a story for a different day.
A lot of dark stuff going on in the world right now, and it's to the point where I don't even believe my own eyes anymore because I cannot verify what people are saying about all the political violence, the division. I partner with this production company called Ironclad, and we're doing an 8-part audio series on PSYOPs, on why foreign countries, governments, maybe even our own government, would conduct a PSYOP on its own people. And I just think that this series is going to be extremely important because it's going to open the eyes of people on why these things happen. You can head over to psyopshow.com, order it today. I think you're going to get a lot out of this. Who's pulling the strings? Who's pulling them?
Now, the US has carried out at this point strikes in both the Caribbean and the Pacific, claiming to target drug routes from Colombia, Venezuela, and Mexico. I'm pretty sure Bolivia and Peru were mentioned. And we do know that these are hotspots. Now, here's the thing, and it's very important to keep in mind. Venezuela is not this narco hotspot that the administration may be making it out to be. Most drugs, and the majority of them, are being produced in Colombia, Peru, Bolivia, and Mexico. Like I said, if we're talking about down south, let's not even talk about Canada for a moment. If strikes started happening in Canada, that would be insane. Okay, whoa, that would likely never happen. Now, Venezuela is sort of the underdog in all of this. And so that's why from the get-go, I really thought that these strikes were sort of unwarranted, because who are these people on the boats? Now, let's say the strikes started with this Acapulco strike, okay? These 4 strikes in Acapulco that killed 14 people. I truly believe that a lot of people would be less critical of these strikes generally, because Acapulco, narco hotspot, Mexico, where the cartels are operating. And we know that these drugs are being smuggled, and precursors too, into the port of Acapulco. Venezuela, no. But we know that there could be sort of hidden agenda there, and there are a lot of people that talk about it. Let's focus on the drugs. Now, these routes are historically maritime extensions of land-based trafficking corridors. The DEA and the Navy have monitored these for years, but these lethal strikes, deadly strikes, are unprecedented. We haven't seen this before, and like I said, and I will continue to push for this, it is particularly concerning that we don't know who is being killed, which cartels are being targeted, and what was actually being smuggled. Because my real concern here is that I do believe that there were human trafficking victims on board these vessels. It's really hard to believe that there wasn't, okay? The US recently sanctioned Colombia's President Gustavo Petro, accusing him of allowing cartels to flourish. And then Colombia's deputy foreign minister also essentially condemned the strikes. He said that they're disproportionate and outside international law, basically pointing out that the boats had no mean to defend themselves, but more importantly, they had access to no due legal process. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the world's largest warship, was deployed to the Caribbean last week, which was, of course, an unmistakable signal of power projection in that region of the hemisphere, honestly. The U.S. is also accused, of course, as we know, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro of personally leading a trafficking network. He obviously denies this. Come on, Maduro. We all know at this point. And he says the strikes are an attempt to overthrow his government, which, yeah, probably. But more than anything, just name the people. I think you guys are going to get annoyed with me for saying that so many times. But I think that, at least in the way that I report and access my information and I'm able to dig deeper, I just need a name. And it really clears the air. You've seen this in a lot of my really high stakes reporting. The amount that I can do with just a name, just your name, even if it's just like a first initial with a last name, I could tell you everything you want to know about anyone. It's kind of worrisome, I'm not gonna lie. So the big question here, I guess, it's pretty obvious. What's driving Washington? Well, of course, this administration argues that they're defending the homeland from these deadly drugs. It's 2 decades of foreign wars, and this is now like a domestic refocus of U.S. military might. I gotta put the shot out there, but when I broke that story about the babies being trafficked from Juarez into the U.S., 3 weeks after I broke that story, NCTC addressed it and came out with their press release. They even, there was a press conference with Tulsi Gabbard. They were talking about this whole thing, and it was never once mentioned that the buyers of these trafficked babies coming from the murdered women were Americans in El Paso. And so I think that if we're reigniting this domestic focus, there also needs to be a lamp held to focusing on Americans that are also fueling and aiding and financing these very criminals out of country. Because without American dollars, and I spoke about this in a recent dispatch, I think it was the fuel theft one, but without American dollars, there would not be this much money in all of these guys' operations. Now, militarizing the drug war, even just handing over a lot of the sort of cartel activities to NCTC and sort of away from the DEA, it sidesteps Congress, okay? It allows unilateral executive action under this counterterrorism framing, which is technically valid because they are designated as foreign terrorist organizations. But if that means sidestepping due process, especially considering the proximity of Mexico to the US, it's not frickin' Afghanistan, and the accessibility to the very people that they're targeting. I mean, a lot of these narcos are active on social media, or their girlfriends are, or their side chicks are, or their kids are. They're not hard to find. Give me a name. This obviously is sort of blurring this line between criminal justice and warfare. Because you're telling me that 17 members of El Chapo's family can just mosey on into the United States and be given like some form of asylum, but then 14 guys on a boat off the coast of Acapulco that we don't even know what their names are or who they were working for or what they had on their vessel are dead? The math is just not mathing for me here. This is really creating a precedent for state-sanctioned executions based on purely suspicion. I know what you guys are going to say, or at least some of you. Katarina, you really don't think that this administration gathered the intel and information in order to conduct this? Yeah, of course I believe that. Obviously. At the end of the day, it still allows this sort of gray area for there to be collateral damage that we will never know about. It's still a double standard when major capos, drug lords who are being prosecuted in the US are getting plea deals and their families are getting safety. And then at the same time, this is going on. When these people are just suspects and not proven traffickers, and I mean literally on paper, there's no charges, there's no due process, no identification before being blown up at sea, I don't think it justifies these strikes. I'm not trying to convince you guys of this. I want to make that clear. You guys are going to say, yes, you are. Anytime I sort of try to give like a side note to when I'm going off on like a little tangent, you guys are like, no, you are being biased or whatever. I'm not trying to convince you guys of one thing or another. I think it's important to look at both sides of what's going on because this is a very nuanced topic. Okay, the war on drugs is not black and white. That is matter of fact. Anyone will tell you that. And I actually will have someone on this podcast next week that I think you guys are going to be very excited about because this person could tell you with years of unmatched experience exactly why the war on drugs is not black and white. And so when we're discussing actual people being killed during the war on drugs, you have to look at it from a nuanced standpoint. A great example of this is when that whole story about Valeria Marquez, the TikToker who was shot on TikTok Live in Guadalajara, that story went viral everywhere. And when I was asked about that, I made it very clear. Sure, she was not a perfect victim, she was dating someone or some guys that had connections to cartels, it doesn't mean what happened to her was justified. And I think it's really important that when we're reading about these topics and when I'm going on the ground and doing the work, when you guys are consuming this content, to be really critical of every piece of information and try to grasp some level of understanding from both sides. It's just like objectively important, okay? That's my spiel. Now, I think in a way it's also sort of undermining cooperation with Mexico, Colombia, maybe Venezuela, but at that point, that's a nation that's stretched so thin by violence and instability. I think cooperation is a long shot. And I think that's why there were so many vessels that were struck by the US. I'm really curious to see how this is going to play out. What more is President Claudia Sheinbaum going to say? It wouldn't surprise me if maybe President Claudia Sheinbaum was tipped off about this happening, but she couldn't say anything. You know what? I'm going to reach out to my sources on that. We're going to talk about that in the next episode. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to this episode of Borderland Dispatches, an Ironclad original with yours truly, Katarina Schultz. And as always, see you next time.